Picture on the screens right now is probably the most iconic picture from World War II. I'm sure everyone knows what that is. And our next speaker, Barney Leone, we've been talking about the European theater. Barney was in the Pacific theater. There's a whole other war going on there, as everybody knows. And so Barney was off the coast of Iwo Jima on the USS Nemasket. And he's going to talk to us a little bit about the Pacific theater. Barney Leone. We might go just a little bit over 12, guys, so sit tight. Okay.
A little change of pace for you. I know you've been high up in the high altitude, but I'm going to take you down to the sea level. And if you're worried about how long I'm going to be speaking, I am only 5'4", so I'm a short speaker. It is a pleasure to be with you. You may be surprised, what is a Navy man doing with the Air Force? Well, it's quite all right. I've been invited to go to 43rd Bomber Group by a good friend of mine. Leon Waldman here. Leon, take a stand. And he begged me to join him one time at one of the meetings, and I kept refusing to go. I said, I have no one I know in the Air Force but you. What am I going to do there? Well, he said to me, you come anyway. He says, you know, I have a hotel room. You can stay with me. All you need is an air ticket. Well, he said, we're going to New Orleans. When he said New Orleans, I decided I'd go. And the reason why I decided to go was, it's exactly where I picked up my ship in New Orleans. And I wanted to go back to New Orleans. Not so much about reminiscing about where I picked up my ship, but in New Orleans, the greatest tasting sweet tea I ever drank in my life was there, and I wanted to get some more tea. But anyway, it is a pleasure to be with the group, and thank you so much for inviting me to speak to you this morning. My first mission in combat was at Iwo Jima. I'm on a Navy fuel ship. It was filled with aviation gas, which made me eligible to be able to be adopted by the 43rd Bomber Group with the aviation gas. That's my excuse anyway. But listen to this. My ship was ordered to be close to the base of Mount Suribachi, about a couple hundred yards off the beach. And we were given explicit orders by the Admiral not to do any firing whatsoever. Now we were, even though we were not a warship, we were well armed. We had 12 20mm guns and 4 3-inch cannons on our ship. But being loaded with aviation gas, you don't want to attract fire if you start firing anything. So we had to stand still. My position was on the starboard side of the bridge. It's the right side of the ship, on a 12mm gun. And I had a bird's eye view of the whole island. The island was not that big. I was shocked at seeing that all the sand was black because it's a volcanic island, not active, and all the sand was black there. And I described the scene as like being at a ball game sitting at home plate. But while I was viewing the island with my binoculars, even though I was real close, I didn't see one Japanese soldier on that island. I wasn't aware at the time that they had a tunnel. The island was only about 5 miles long, and they had a tunnel underneath the whole island. And the Japanese stayed in that tunnel, and in Mount Suribachi, they stayed secluded inside the cave. They knew we were coming, evidently, but you know, we bombed Iwo Jima a whole month before we even got there, and the week that we were there, and we all formed our group at anchorage around the island, it was bombed another whole week. Bomb after bomb after bomb after bomb, from battleships, destroyers, and the aircraft carriers bringing their planes in on. I never seen so many bombs on a small island go. I thought the island would actually sink. But you know what? It didn't sink. I didn't see any Japanese. But suddenly, one day, day 2, I think it was, or day 3, I see something flying on top of Mount Suribachi. I didn't know exactly whose flag it was. I couldn't believe it would be our flag because I couldn't think our Marines could ever get up on top of that mountain in that short period of time. But suddenly with my binoculars, I saw the stars and stripes. I got goose pimples. I yelled to my shipmates, "That's our flag up there! That's our flag!" I was surprised. I was amazed. I don't know how it was accomplished. When I turned around, I looked at the United States flag flying on the mast of my ship. Some of my shipmates were talking about maybe if we survive through this, we can get some Japanese artifacts. I wasn't interested in getting anything from the Japanese. First of all, we Navy men don't go on the beach. We stay put on our ship. I wouldn't have the nerve if I had came across a Marine and asked him who put his life on the line a lot closer than I did on the ship, could you give me something from that you might have taken back from some dead Japanese? But you know what I decided? When I saw Old Glory on top of Mount Suribachi, I was so excited about that, and looked around and saw the flag that was flying on our ship. I knew that our flag and our ship eventually gets changed when it gets weather beaten. I went to the quartermaster after Iwo Jima. We went to Okinawa, and I said to the quartermaster, "Well, listen, when you pull down that flag to change the flag, would you mind saving it for me? I want a souvenir from our ship in memory of what I seen up at Mount Suribachi, that famous photograph that you saw." I never saw that photograph. We don't get any newspapers on the ship. We didn't know anything about that. But I knew that flag meant a whole lot to me. So I got the flag, didn't say anything to my fellow shipmates, put it in my locker. When I got home 3 years later, put it in my closet. Incidentally, my father was in World War I in the infantry. He got the Purple Heart, got wounded in France. I have a picture of my dad in uniform at 20 years of age in World War I, and a picture of me 20 years of age in World War II. If you're glad to see it, I'll be glad to show it to you. Many years later, I never talked about that flag. I was living in New York. I was transferred to Ohio. I moved to Ohio, incidentally. I'm an ordained minister now. I was. I took the flag with me, and then when I got to California, I joined the veterans group, and they asked me if I would speak to them. And I brought my flag to the group, and I displayed the flag and told the story I'm going to tell you. I'm only regretting that I didn't bring the flag with me this time. But I promise you, if I have an opportunity to come back to speak to you again, I'll bring that Old Glory to show you that tattered flag that flew over my ship during Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Would you like to see that? Only one condition, you have to invite me to come back. But I'll be glad to do it. Now let me get you to the real important fact. You've been high up in the air, I'm going to take you down to sea level. You know what came vivid to my mind every time I tell that story? My ship would be the last ship that the first wave of Marines would pass on the way in. As they came by, those of us who were topside in our gun positions, like I told you, we were not to do any firing whatsoever. We gave them the hand signal and wished them well. You know something? Now, one Marine looked in our direction. You know what I see in my mind every time I tell that story? If this was their rifle, straight ahead. And you know something? They look frightened. I know I would be too, going in, not knowing what to expect. And I didn't see any Japanese on that island on the surface at all. I believe those Marines thought the same thing I did. How could they ever survive that tremendous bombing day and night? Constantly. We didn't know that those Japanese were secured underneath that ground. At least I didn't know. I'm sure those Marines didn't know either. And inside that cave on Mount Suribachi, and our ships began to bombard the peak of that mountain, Mount Suribachi, to cause some landslide, maybe to cover the mouths of those caves. Didn't work. You had to wait for manpower to go in. Let me tell you something. I was a sailor in the United States Navy, but I have the highest regards of our United States Marines. They're the bravest men I ever saw in my life. And you know something? I don't know of any veteran, myself included, and I'm sure you pilots thought the same way, or you're airmen. We didn't want to die, but we were willing to do that if it meant for us to save our freedom. I speak in many schools, one in particular, every semester about World War II history. A teacher started that many years ago, about 8 years ago, and he tries to find a World War II veteran to speak to the class. I had the privilege of going for 8 straight semesters. And you know what I tell the students? I want them to know something. I don't dwell so much about the gruesomeness of war. War's hell, by the way. In my opinion, nobody really wins a war. Both sides really lose when you come down to think of the calculation that takes place. But we didn't start the war, but we sure as hell finished it. And thank you for all the brave men and women that went and served during that time. So I tell the students, I want you to understand something. The freedom that you are enjoying right here today didn't come free. Somebody was willing to lay down their life so that you can enjoy that freedom. And I began to point to 30 students in the class, and I said, you know what? They died for you, for you, for you, for you. All 30. And the last person I pointed to, you probably would guess it was me. They died for me too. And I tell the students, I feel obligated to speak in their behalf because they're not able to come here to tell you what they did for you and me. And I count it as a mission. I'll be 95 years old on the 25th of this month. And I count it as a mission. I think God has kept me that long to begin to tell that story to these young people about freedom that they're enjoying, that it didn't come free to them or you or me. And we ought to take advantage of that and thank the good Lord. And that airman that was blessed by the Pope, I'm glad you put your focus more on God than the man himself. And we ought to thank God. You know, we're the greatest nation in the world. And we ought to keep it that way and not allow anybody to take it away from us. And thank every brave veteran that was willing to go into the service. I went in, I was 18 and a half years old. I wanted to go, would you believe this? I wanted to go to the Air Force. And when we went in, by the way, I don't consider myself a draftee. My father was in World War I. I was willing to go, but I didn't want to hurt my dad's feelings. So I waited. I knew I was going to be called. And the reason why I don't call myself a draftee, I'll tell you why. When I got a letter from the President of the United States, it said, you are a selective volunteer. That's what I am. But you probably are that too, if you look at your letter. Well, anyway, when I got through speaking to those students, the teacher makes them write a journal, and they mail them to me. It brought tears to my eyes to see every one of those students, seniors, by the way, in high school, understand. And they said, you opened our eyes. I'm going to appreciate now what you've told us to understand about our freedom. Isn't that wonderful? You know, I have some sad news to tell you. You probably are aware of it too. A lot of the professors in our universities are doing a lousy job teaching education about the truth of our country, and they're warping the minds of our students. So much so, they don't want to listen with somebody who has a difference of opinion than they have. And so you probably read the same thing I read in our newspapers of the rioting at these universities whenever a so-called conservative speaker goes to speak to the students there, they won't allow them to speak, and they begin to riot. And these ignorant college students, you know what they do? They start rioting. The very university that they're attending, they start to destroy that very university. Does that make sense? I'm going to tell you a little story. After the war, we were the first Americans to land in Shanghai, China. I'm on the streets of Shanghai, China. I never saw so much poverty in all my life when I got there. We came across two Chinese men arguing fiercely in the middle of the street. I'm telling this story to the students like I'm going to tell you now. I have to be ashamed to admit that as sailors gathered around watching these two Chinese men arguing, and we were not interested in what they were arguing about. We were waiting to see it end up in a fist fight. So I apologized to the students as I was saying this. Could you imagine we just finished a war and we were anxious to watch a fist fight? But I learned something from that fist fight that didn't take place. That was 75 years ago I'm talking to you about now. And so after they argued for about 20 minutes, they suddenly stopped and walked away. We were disappointed. We didn't see our fist fight. I looked around. I saw another Chinese man that looked a little bit dressed, and most of them were there. And with the best of my ability, I went over to him and I asked him something. How come we didn't see a fist fight? You know what he told me? Would you like to hear what he said? I'm glad you were, because I'm going to tell you anyway. He said, in China, when two people are arguing with each other, the first person to raise his hand and hit the other person automatically loses the argument because there's nothing more to say. Does that make sense? I'm telling the students this, and I said, you know, we could have, or somebody could have a difference of opinion than we have, and we could debate it, we could discuss it, but if you think you're going to win your argument by fighting and beating them over it, you lose, because you run out of something to say. And then I remind the students, like I'm going to remind you, if you're discussing something that's a little different of opinion than what you have, and the other person might have a better opinion and making more sense of what you have to say, maybe we ought to listen to what the other person says and put it together. And you know something? You know what God said in the Bible? He didn't say, come let us argue together. He said, come and let us reason together. Open up your Bibles and you'll find it there. God said that. I'm sure every one of us sometimes have some questions about what God has to say. Some things happen in our life and we sometimes blame God. How come God is blamed for everything that's bad that happens in the world? And how very few people ever give thanks to God when something good happens in the world. But God said, that's okay. You may have a difference of opinion in what I'm doing, but come, let us reason together. And that's the attitude we should have with one another. When we come to reason together, we will never fight one another. And I'm so happy to bring that message, not only to these young students that receive the message, and I am twice as sure you senior citizens here have been through a lot in your lifetime too, that you will accept it as well. Now, next time I come, if you invite me, I'll bring the flag, and I'll like you to stand and take a picture. It would be my honor to take a picture with my flag. If you have any questions, I'll be glad to take them before I stop. Thank you so much for having me.